In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women ran what looked like a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. 600 women passed through its gates, each searching for spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned, and those who did came back changed. Buried deep within the Maine State Archives is a testimony from one survivor, so disturbing, so haunting, that authorities kept it sealed for over a century. Tonight, we open that seal. This is the story of what truly happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. But before we descend into the darkness, understand this. This channel is not for everyone. It's for the brave, for those who dare to unearth the most unsettling chapters of American history. If you think you have the courage to face what hides in the shadows of our past, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. What state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to walk with us through the unknown? We're about to find out. What makes this story especially chilling is not demons, nor divine madness. It's something colder, sharper, the relentless pursuit of knowledge, no matter the cost. A pursuit that wore the mask of Christian mercy. In the late 18th century, the District of Maine was still a remote outpost of Massachusetts. A wilderness territory where scattered communities fought to survive brutal winters and even harsher truths. The coastal town of Millbridge, home to barely 300 souls, served as a lifeline, a rough-hewn trading post for lumbermen and fishermen daring enough to brave the unforgiving Atlantic. 15 miles inland, beyond a maze of dense forest, marked only by fading Native American hunting trails, lay a tract of land destined to become a name whispered with dread, a place forever linked with horrors unspoken. It was on a gray October morning in 1798 that the Ashford women arrived. Their horse-drawn wagon creaked into Millbridge, stacked high with sealed crates and medical instruments, cargo that stirred uneasy whispers among the townsfolk. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford descended first. She moved with the regal bearing of old-world aristocracy. A woman in her early 40s, her auburn hair streaked with silver, her storm-gray eyes scanning the village with unsettling precision. Her voice carried the polish of England's upper class, her demeanor the cool authority of someone long accustomed to obedience without question. Next came Sister Prudence Ashford, a tall, austere woman of 30, her skin pale as bone china. Her hands, long and deft, moved with the practiced finesse of a master artisan. Her fingers were long and pale, unnaturally steady, a trait that, in time, would prove vital to the grotesque tasks she would perform. Unlike her superior, Sister Prudence spoke rarely. She watched the world in silence, her pale blue eyes betraying nothing, detached, unreadable. And when she did speak, her voice carried the soft lilt of a Scottish accent, refined, yes, but with a chill beneath the surface that unsettled even the hardest frontiersman. The youngest of the trio, novice Temperance Ashford, looked scarcely older than 22. She possessed a haunting beauty that drew immediate notice. Raven black hair, porcelain skin, and eyes as dark as midnight, as if hiding ancient, unspoken truths. Yet there was something wrong about her beauty, something that made mothers draw their children near without knowing why. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and she had a disturbing habit of watching people, not with interest, but with analysis, as though they were pinned insects under glass. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns, fleeing religious persecution in England, come to build a new spiritual order in the American wilderness. They carried with them impeccable letters of recommendation, signed by high-ranking English clergy. Letters that would, in time, be exposed as brilliant forgeries. But at the time, the story was persuasive enough to win over the Protestant settlers of Millbridge, who welcomed the arrival of educated, godly women as a sign of progress and civility for their untamed frontier. With a supply of gold coins that seemed inexhaustible, the Ashford sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of remote forest land from a grateful widow, one drowning in the debts left by her late husband. They paid 3 times the land's assessed value, a price that raised a few eyebrows, but also ensured the enthusiastic cooperation of local officials. Without delay, they hired every available carpenter, mason, and laborer in the region to begin construction on their so-called religious retreat. What rose from the forest over the next 8 months was unlike any house of worship the workers had ever encountered. 3 stories of cold gray stone, quarried from the nearby coastline. Its walls were unnervingly thick, dense enough to swallow sound. The windows were small, narrow slits set high above eye level, making it impossible to peer inside from the ground. But what stood out most was the basement. Excavated far deeper than necessary and reinforced with heavy foundations, it was clear this level wasn't meant for storing food or firewood. Its design suggested a different purpose, one no one dared to question too closely. When asked about the odd architecture, Mother Superior Agatha replied with a calm, practiced smile. Penitence requires solitude, and solitude requires proper containment. Our sisters in England have learned that spiritual healing is most effective when the penitent is completely removed from worldly distractions. The explanation satisfied most, at least on the surface. But a few older workers couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Why, they wondered in hushed tones, did a house of God need to resemble a fortress? The Ashford women oversaw every detail of the construction with unwavering precision. Nothing escaped their notice. They demanded a series of peculiar modifications: reinforced doors fitted with heavy iron locks, drainage systems capable of handling unusually large volumes of liquid, and ventilation shafts designed more like those found in infirmaries than in any convent. When questioned about these features, the sisters offered calm, practiced replies. They spoke of European religious institutions, places, they claimed, where intensive spiritual healing required specialized infrastructure. Most accepted these explanations without further inquiry. Among their earliest and most vocal supporters was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the circuit physician who rode between scattered frontier settlements. A man in his 50s, with a reputation for progressive views on medicine, Dr. Hartwell was immediately captivated by the sisters' apparent expertise in what he termed feminine psychology. During their first conversation, he found himself astonished by the depth of their knowledge, speaking fluently about conditions that most American doctors scarcely understood. The sisters possess remarkable insight into the nature of feminine hysteria and melancholia, he wrote in his journal. Their methods, though unconventional, rest upon sound medical reasoning, approaches I believe to be decades ahead of our current practice. They seek to address the root causes of mental disturbance, not merely suppress the outward symptoms. What Dr. Hartwell chose not to include in his official journal was the private arrangement he made with Mother Superior Agatha, a conversation conducted in the parlor, behind closed doors. In return for referring difficult cases to the convent and securing medical supplies through his professional network, Dr. Hartwell would receive a generous monthly stipend, along with exclusive access to detailed patient records, material that could significantly advance his own standing in the medical community. For a frontier physician, struggling to keep his practice afloat, it was an offer far too valuable to decline. And so the convent's reputation began to spread, quietly, but with astonishing speed. From the hills of Portsmouth to the wharves of Portland, even reaching the refined parlors of Boston, whispered stories circulated of 3 extraordinary sisters in Maine, women who could take the unruly, the unstable, the disobedient, and return them polished, penitent, and perfectly reformed. The cost was steep: $20 silver for a month of treatment, $50 for a 3-month transformation, and $100 for what they called a complete reformation. But for families burdened by scandalous daughters, melancholic wives, or rebellious sisters, it seemed a fair trade for peace and the restoration of social order. The women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears reflected the silent fears of an uneasy age. There were unmarried mothers who refused to name the fathers of their children, wives who had dared to contradict their husbands in public, daughters who rejected arranged marriages, and among them, too, were women who simply read too much, who questioned too freely, or spoke too often of politics, learning, and liberty. The common thread among the convent's residents was defiance, women who had stepped, however slightly, beyond the narrow confines of what society deemed acceptable feminine behavior. Religious tensions of the time also shaped the convent's clientele. Puritan families, alarmed by daughters showing interest in Anglican or Methodist teachings, quietly sent them away. Anglican households in turn exiled daughters who had been drawn to the fervent ecstasies of Baptist revival meetings. The Ashford sisters welcomed all with equal fervor. They claimed their methods transcended denominational lines, rooted not in doctrine but in the universal power of Christian discipline. The first sign that something was deeply, irreparably wrong at the Convent of Eternal Tears came on a bitter February night in 1803. Thomas Brewster, a 20-year-old trapper, was deep in the forest surrounding the convent, tracking a wounded deer through the snow-choked silence. He had spent his entire life in those woods. He knew their sounds intimately. The brittle crack of ice-laden branches, the long howl of distant wolves, the sigh of wind curling through pine. But what he heard that night was not natural. It was unmistakably human. From behind the convent's towering stone walls came screams rising and falling in tortured waves. At times they broke into pleading whimpers, only to erupt again into raw animal shrieks, sounds so filled with suffering they seemed to warp the very air around them. Thomas froze, the breath caught in his chest. Whatever was happening behind those walls, it was not healing, and it was not holy. Abandoning the wounded deer, Thomas crept closer to the looming stone structure, each footstep sinking into the snow as his heart pounded against his ribs. The screams hadn't stopped. In fact, they seemed to intensify with every step he took. The building was dark, lifeless from the outside. But as he moved around toward the rear, he noticed a faint, flickering glow bleeding through narrow basement windows half buried beneath the snowdrifts. The closer he got, the more the sounds came into focus. The screams, yes, but also something else. The cold clink of metal instruments. Urgent voices speaking in hushed tones. And beneath it all, a slow, rhythmic noise that could only be described as sawing. Crouching beside a frost-coated basement window, Thomas wiped away the condensation with the sleeve of his coat, and saw something he would never forget, not even on his deathbed. The basement had been transformed into a crude surgical theater, lit by a chaotic constellation of oil lamps and candles. Their flames cast restless shadows across the damp stone walls. At the center of the room, a woman was strapped to a heavy wooden table, her wrists and ankles bound with thick leather restraints. Her head was locked in place by a cruel-looking iron brace that resembled an instrument of torture more than anything medical. Standing over her was Sister Prudence. Her usually pallid face was flushed with fierce concentration as she guided a long, slender metal rod with terrifying precision. The patient's head had been partially shaved, exposing a pale scalp marked with dark lines guides, perhaps for whatever procedure was underway. But the most horrifying detail was unmistakable. There was an opening in the woman's skull. Thomas could see it, the gleam of exposed bone, and beneath it, something darker. With a wave of nausea, he understood what he was looking at: brain tissue. The woman's eyes were wide with unfiltered terror, her face a mask of agony. She screamed with a force that seemed to tear the air itself. But what made the scene truly nightmarish wasn't the suffering. It was the cold, clinical detachment of those inflicting it. Mother Superior Agatha stood just feet away, a leather-bound notebook in hand, calmly jotting down observations as if she were recording a lecture in a university hall. Novice Temperance stood beside her, passing instruments to Sister Prudence with mechanical precision. Her movements swift, exact, eerily practiced. Thomas remained frozen at the window, breath fogging the glass, unable to look away as Sister Prudence guided the metal rod deeper into the exposed skull. The screaming reached a fever pitch, a raw crescendo that seemed to reverberate through the stone walls of the convent. And then, silence. The woman's body went limp, her voice cut off mid-scream as she slipped into unconsciousness. But the sisters didn't flinch. They continued their work with exacting focus, unbothered by the fact that their patient was no longer responsive, perhaps no longer even alive. That was the moment Thomas finally broke. He turned and fled into the darkness, stumbling blindly through knee-deep snow, heart racing, lungs burning with cold. But he would never truly escape what he saw. That chamber burned itself into his memory. The methodical procedures, the calm professionalism, and above all, the chilling realization. This was not the first time it had happened, and it would not be the last. When Thomas stumbled into town the following morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, wild-eyed and half-frozen, babbling about torture chambers and brain surgery with such fevered intensity that his father feared the boy had lost his mind. The elder Brewster, a stern, pragmatic man who placed community order above all else, listened in growing alarm as his son recounted a nightmare that sounded more like something torn from the pages of a Gothic novel than from a respected religious institution. "Thomas," he said slowly, carefully, "you were hunting alone, in a blizzard, after tracking a wounded animal through the night. The mind can play tricks in such conditions. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure, something necessary. The sisters treat delicate feminine conditions, treatments that might seem strange to the untrained eye. But Thomas would not be dismissed. His descriptions were too precise, too vivid. He recalled the exact layout of the basement chamber, the arrangement of lamps, the strange instruments gleaming under candlelight. And most disturbingly, he recounted the cold, measured way the sisters performed their work. Methodical, practiced, disturbingly professional. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was a system. And it was being carried out beneath the stone walls of a convent the town had welcomed with open arms. Unnerved, the elder Brewster decided he needed counsel. He turned to the one man whose word carried weight in Millbridge, Deacon Morrison. The deacon was a cautious man, slow to judge, and deeply invested in the preservation of moral and civic order. His voice had long served as the compass for the town's uneasy balance between faith and reason. Now, it would be put to the test. For 5 years, the Ashford sisters had been model citizens, generous donors to local charities and paragons of decorum during their rare public appearances. More importantly, several prominent families in the region currently had daughters, sisters, or wives undergoing treatment at the convent. "We must tread carefully," Deacon Morrison said after hearing Thomas's account. "Accusations of this kind could ruin lives. These are women of the cloth, respected, admired, not criminals. Surely there's a reasonable explanation for what the boy believes he saw." But while the deacon valued discretion, he was not a man to ignore a serious allegation. He agreed to look into the matter quietly. The following week, he arranged a visit to the convent under the pretense of organizing a church fundraising event that would benefit from the sisters' involvement. Mother Superior Agatha welcomed him into the convent's austere parlor, a cold, sparsely furnished room dominated by a large wooden crucifix and somber religious paintings that seemed to study visitors with quiet condemnation. Her demeanor was impeccable, warm, composed, entirely at ease. She served tea with practiced grace and asked after his family, with what seemed like genuine interest. When the deacon cautiously broached the topic, mentioning that some hunters had reported unsettling sounds coming from the convent at night, Mother Superior Agatha responded with nothing more than a serene smile and a look of gentle understanding. "Deacon Morrison," she said in her refined English accent, "we often hold intensive prayer sessions during the quiet hours, particularly for our most troubled residents. The path to spiritual cleansing is not always peaceful. It can be vocal, especially for women burdened by lives of sin and moral decay." She explained that many of the women who came to them arrived in states of deep spiritual affliction, possessed, as she put it, by demons of pride, lust, and rebellion that resisted the purifying force of Christian discipline with terrible ferocity. Some souls, she added with gentle sorrow, had allowed evil to take such deep root within that its extraction required great effort, both spiritual and physical. "The sounds your hunters heard," she said softly, "were likely the cries of demons being cast out, through prayer, penance, and divine authority." Her tone was calm, sincere, and underpinned by a theological sophistication that impressed even the skeptical deacon. The notion of spiritual warfare was hardly foreign to frontier Christians, and the belief that especially corrupted souls might require extreme measures for salvation seemed, in that moment, entirely plausible. To further ease his concerns, Mother Superior Agatha offered to guide him through the upper levels of the convent. She led him through sparse but immaculately kept dormitories. In each room, women sat in quiet contemplation, kneeling in prayer, eyes closed, lips moving silently. They appeared serene, but too serene. There was something unsettling about their stillness. They moved with eerie precision, their gestures stiff, as if directed by some invisible hand rather than their own will. And when Deacon Morrison tried to meet their gaze, their eyes passed over him, glassy, unfocused, fixed on something distant and unseen. When he inquired about touring the lower levels, Agatha's composure never faltered. She explained that the basement chambers were reserved for the most intensive cases, women undergoing spiritual counseling too delicate for outside observation. "I'm afraid it would be inappropriate," she said with a modest smile, for a man to witness such deeply personal procedures. Some forms of feminine spiritual corruption require intimate examination of the soul. Exposing them to male eyes could compromise both their dignity and their healing. Within the social norms of the time, Mother Superior Agatha's explanation seemed entirely reasonable, and Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling, at least outwardly, reassured. Perhaps young Thomas Brewster had indeed misunderstood what he'd seen in the dark, amid storm and fear. And yet, something lingered. As the deacon rode home through the snow-laced woods, an unease settled deep in his chest, a quiet wrongness he couldn't define but couldn't shake. The women he had seen at the convent still haunted him. They were too quiet, too still. They moved, not like women in prayer, but like marionettes guided by unseen strings, smooth, synchronized, devoid of the natural spontaneity of the living. And then there was the smell. It hadn't struck him at first, masked as it was beneath the expected mix of medicine, oils, and cleaning spirits. But underneath it, beneath the surface, was something else. Something coppery and sour that stirred memories he had long buried. It reminded him, with chilling clarity, of the field hospitals he had visited during the Revolutionary War. The reek of blood, antiseptic, and silent agony thick enough to coat the inside of the throat. In the days following Deacon Morrison's visit, the Ashford sisters introduced new precautions, more locks, fewer visitors, and stricter boundaries around their work. The night screams that had once echoed through the forest vanished, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It was heavy, suffocating, watching. Still, the town remained convinced. Families continued to send their troubled wives and daughters to the convent, and the sisters received them with open arms and ever more refined promises of spiritual healing and miraculous transformation. But soon, the most observant among Milbridge's residents began to notice troubling patterns, quiet, insidious signs that something was deeply wrong behind the convent's stone facade. Women sent to the Ashford sisters for spiritual correction often returned months later, changed, not healed, not humbled, changed. What emerged were not reformed souls, but altered ones, transformed in ways that eluded logic and defied explanation. Take Mary Prescott. At 19, Mary had been a firebrand, sharp-tongued, quick to laugh, and fiercely independent. Her refusal of 3 suitable suitors had scandalized her family and delighted the town's younger girls, who whispered about her in admiration. She was the sort of girl who argued theology with the minister and challenged every domestic expectation laid before her. Her parents, red-faced with shame and weary of her defiance, sent her to the convent for 6 months of spiritual refinement, convinced the sisters would prepare her for a proper, obedient life. And in a way they had. Mary returned subdued, polite, malleable. Gone was the rebellious daughter with fire in her voice and stars in her eyes. In her place stood a hollow-eyed woman, who answered questions only when spoken to and expressed neither opinion nor desire. Her smile, when it came, was small, tight, and utterly vacant. She accepted the first marriage proposal presented to her without hesitation, as if reading from a script she had never written. At first her parents were pleased, relieved even. But as days turned into weeks, that relief curdled into dread. Mary no longer recognized her favorite foods. Childhood trinkets elicited no reaction. Friends from school came to visit, only to be met with polite disinterest or vacant stares. When her mother showed her letters she had written just before entering the convent, witty, impassioned notes scrawled in her familiar looping hand, Mary studied them like a stranger deciphering a foreign language. There was no spark of recognition, no emotion at all. It was as though something deep within her had been erased and replaced with something else. But most disturbing of all was Mary's absence of emotion. Nothing seemed to touch her. No joy, no sorrow, no pleasure, no pain. Her face remained a calm mask, untouched by the world around her. When the Prescott family sought the opinion of Dr. Hartwell, the town's trusted physician, he offered nothing but praise for the Ashford sisters. "In my professional judgment," he stated with smug certainty, "the patient has been cured of the mental deficiencies that once made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood. The rebellious temperament that caused such turmoil in her family has been wholly corrected through proper spiritual discipline." To Mary's mother, however, the doctor's words were cold comfort. She had begun to notice troubling details, small but impossible to ignore. While washing her daughter's hair one evening, she found a series of scars along Mary's scalp. Faint, but deliberate. Not the result of accident or childhood injury, these were clean, systematic incisions, arranged in a pattern that suggested surgical intent. When she gently asked her daughter about them, Mary only smiled faintly and replied, "I don't remember much, Mama. Just praying very hard to become a better woman." She said nothing more. And Mary wasn't the only one. As word of the convent's successes spread across New England, more families sent their troubled daughters, wives, and sisters into the sisters' care. And more returned transformed, quiet, obedient, and stripped of something essential. Hannah Morse, a young widow sent to the convent for melancholia after the death of her infant son, came back 3 months later with a bright, unwavering smile and no memory whatsoever of the child she had once cradled night after night. When her family gently placed the baby's clothes in her lap, soft bonnets and worn blankets she herself had sewn, Hannah only blinked and asked who they belonged to. As if that chapter of her life had not merely faded, but been erased entirely. Elizabeth Thornton's case was perhaps the most disturbing of them all. The wife of a prosperous merchant, she had been sent to the convent for hysteria, after publicly accusing her husband of infidelity and demanding a divorce, behavior considered scandalous enough to endanger both the family's reputation and standing in the town. 4 months later, Elizabeth returned home, a changed woman. She not only retracted her accusations, but insisted calmly and with conviction that she had never made them. More unsettling still, she expressed complete bewilderment when questioned about the events that had led to her confinement. She described her marriage as perfectly harmonious, her husband as virtuous and loving, and her previous outbursts as nonsense she couldn't imagine herself ever uttering. Yet something in her physical condition deeply troubled her relatives. Elizabeth began suffering from debilitating headaches, so severe they often left her confined to bed for days at a time. She struggled to recall the names of family friends she had known for decades. Once familiar streets in her own neighborhood became disorienting. She forgot how to prepare meals she had cooked for years, how to tend the rose garden she once cherished. And like so many others who had returned from the convent cured, she bore faint, deliberate scars upon her scalp, thin, symmetrical lines that disappeared into her hairline like surgical seams. When gently questioned about them, Elizabeth simply frowned and murmured, "I'm sure they're nothing. Perhaps from when I fell, or prayed too hard. I don't remember really." Dr. Hartwell, ever the staunch advocate of the Ashford sisters, dismissed all such concerns. "She is free of the delusions that plagued her," he insisted. "What you see now is a healthy mind restored to proper order. The sisters have performed a miracle." Yet, as the years passed, the doctor himself began to unravel. Once the model of medical propriety, he took increasingly to drink, and was often heard muttering to himself about the cost of progress and the noble burden of science. His conversations turned rambling and incoherent, filled with cryptic references to neurological interventions, spiritual purification through cortical correction, and the sacrifices demanded by true innovation. Those who once admired him began to avoid his company. And still, the convent's doors remained open, its corridors quiet, and its sisters always ready to accept another troubled soul in need of cleansing. To curious locals, Mother Superior Agatha explained that the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments for women's mental afflictions, an enlightened fusion of Christian spiritual healing and the latest advancements in European medical science. Her calm authority, genteel speech, and evident education made the claims sound not only plausible, but admirable to a community that valued both piety and progress. Yet not everyone was reassured. Some townsfolk remained quietly disturbed by the changes they saw in the women who emerged from the convent's care, changes that seemed less like healing and more like erasure. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had been sent to the convent and returned with the same vacant obedience now so common among former patients, began asking discreet questions of other families. What she uncovered chilled her. None of the women who had received extended treatment, particularly those sent to the basement's spiritual counseling levels, could recall their time there. Their memories were shattered and sparse, A few fragments of prayer, a flash of candlelight, the sound of voices chanting scripture. Beyond that, a perfect void. As she pressed further, Martha discovered something even more alarming. Some women had never come back at all. When families inquired about their missing daughters, sisters, or wives, the Ashford sisters offered gentle, smiling reassurances. The women, they said, had undergone such profound spiritual renewal that they had chosen to remain within the convent's sacred walls, dedicating their lives entirely to God. They had taken vows, Agatha explained, of silence, solitude, and submission, rejecting all ties to their former lives. But when relatives asked to see their loved ones or even exchange a letter, they were met with firm refusal. Their journey must not be interrupted, came the reply. To do so would endanger the purity of their transformation. And so the questions faded into whispers, and the missing remained out of reach, swallowed by the cold, silent stone of the convent's inner sanctum. The mystery only deepened when Martha discovered that the convent was now accepting patients from far beyond the borders of Maine. Wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, even as far south as Charleston, were sending their most troublesome daughters to the remote Ashford institution, apparently willing to pay extraordinary sums and endure long journeys in pursuit of the sisters' promise. Total behavioral transformation. With the surge in demand, the convent's fees had risen sharply. The Ashford sisters now charged up to $500 for what they called comprehensive reformation, a 6-month process that guaranteed the permanent elimination of all undesirable traits and tendencies. By the time the convent entered its second decade, the Ashford sisters had become recognized authorities on feminine mental disorders, their reputation extending into the academic and medical circles of both America and Europe. They were no longer viewed merely as spiritual caretakers, but as pioneers, women of science cloaked in religious devotion, whose remarkable success rates were meticulously documented and widely circulated. Some of the era's most esteemed physicians and scholars began corresponding with them, drawn in by the detail and consistency of their case studies. Among the most devoted was Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School, who maintained an active exchange of letters with the sisters for over 15 years. His preserved writings, now housed in the Harvard archives, testify to his growing admiration. Your documentation of behavioral modification techniques surpasses anything I have encountered in contemporary European literature. The precision with which you correlate specific physical interventions with predictable personality changes suggests a level of understanding that our profession will not achieve for decades. The sisters' work, once cloaked in modest claims of prayer and discipline, had begun to evolve into something else entirely, something more clinical, more calculated, and far more unsettling. What Dr. Whitmore failed to grasp was that the detailed reports he so admired were clinical accounts of procedures that would, in later decades, be recognized as primitive lobotomies, trepanation, and systematic neurological mutilation. The Ashford sisters had, through years of unrestricted human experimentation, developed a chillingly advanced understanding of cranial anatomy and brain function, far beyond what any legitimate researcher of the time could claim. While contemporary scientists relied on animal models and post-mortem dissections, the sisters worked directly on living human minds. Their methodology was disturbingly meticulous. Each patient's file included comprehensive records of personality traits, behavior patterns, emotional tendencies, and spiritual deficiencies. After each procedure, they documented every outcome with a precision that rivaled the most respected medical institutions. Every shift in memory, mood, cognition, and obedience was tracked. Each deviation from the pre-treatment baseline was logged, measured, and analyzed not out of compassion, but in pursuit of refinement. Their goal was predictability. Over time, their surgical methods grew increasingly precise. Sister Prudence, in particular, became adept at what she called targeted cranial intervention. She devised a system of accessing key regions of the brain through strategically chosen entry points, methods that would not be rediscovered by formal neurosurgery for nearly a century. Decades later, her anatomical sketches would be unearthed, stunningly detailed diagrams of the human skull and brain, annotated with angular measurements, incision depths, and tool trajectories. Evidence of a grisly mastery earned through countless living trials. And the procedures themselves? They were conducted with a cold clinical detachment that made them all the more horrifying. Patients were typically sedated with laudanum or similar opiates, but never enough to render them fully unconscious. The sisters needed them responsive, able to answer questions, follow commands, and react in real time as steel touched nerve and memory unraveled under pressure. Novice Temperance had by this time become the group's foremost authority on what they termed psychological conditioning and behavioral reconstruction. She devised intricate systems for reinforcing the effects of the sisters' surgical interventions, elaborate regimens built on precisely calibrated combinations of reward and punishment, sensory manipulation, and mental coercion. Her protocols included restricted diets, sleep deprivation, prolonged exposure to heat or cold, and social isolation, all carefully measured to destabilize the patient's existing identity and open the way for reshaping it according to predefined specifications. But the sisters' innovations didn't stop at physical or psychological extremes. They also became early pioneers in the experimental use of chemical compounds to amplify and accelerate their results. Through their growing network of sympathetic physicians and apothecaries, they obtained access to substances that would not enter legitimate medical use for decades: alkaloids, anesthetics, and early psychotropics. Every chemical trial was documented with the same relentless thoroughness as their surgeries. They tested combinations and dosages, tracking each compound's impact on memory retention, emotional response, and a subject's susceptibility to suggestion and manipulation. By the year 1815, the convent had treated over 400 women, each one catalogued in exhaustive detail. The Ashford sisters maintained precise statistical records, boasting success rates above 90%. Of course, success in their terms meant the total eradication of the traits that had prompted a woman's referral in the first place: rebellion, grief, anger, passion, autonomy, intelligence. Whatever flicker of spirit had made them undesirable was methodically extinguished. They would ask simple questions, issue instructions, then observe the moment something shifted when identity fractured and the subject became someone else entirely. Women who died during treatment were simply marked as failures, their bodies preserved for further study. During this time, the scale of the sisters' operations expanded significantly. They began accepting what they referred to as research volunteers, typically destitute women with no family, no prospects, and no one to inquire after them. These women, prostitutes, vagrants, widows, or the mentally unwell, were offered food, shelter, and a modest payment in exchange for their participation in experimental procedures aimed, as the sisters claimed, at advancing medical understanding of the feminine mind. They were, in truth, disposable test subjects, used to refine the most extreme and invasive techniques the Ashford sisters had yet devised. Documentation of these experiments, later uncovered in sealed archives hidden throughout the convent, reveals a methodical approach to human experimentation that was both scientifically rigorous and morally monstrous. The sisters compiled precise cranial measurements, recorded tissue responses to surgical stimuli, and correlated behavioral shifts to exact points of neural intervention. Every incision, every reaction, every change, meticulously recorded. Beyond their own walls, the sisters had become central figures in a thriving underground network of scientific correspondence. They sold their findings to physicians and institutions across Europe and America, those unable or unwilling to perform such studies themselves but eager for the results. The letters reveal a shadow economy of data, cold, transactional, and brutally efficient. One particularly prolific client was Dr. Hinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, who paid substantial sums for detailed case files describing surgical methods for erasing memory, blunting emotional response, and inducing what he chillingly called compliant behavioral states in female subjects. Ironically, the University of Edinburgh, the very institution that had once expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan, unknowingly became a consumer of her research. Through a network of intermediaries who carefully concealed the true origins of the data, the university purchased findings that were, in fact, products of the Ashford sisters' human experimentation. The material found its way into medical school curricula, where students were taught surgical techniques and psychological frameworks developed not in laboratories, but in the basement of a convent hidden in the Maine wilderness. Yet even this unsettling irony pales in comparison to what came next. By the late 1810s, the Ashford sisters had begun accepting private commissions, requests from wealthy families, seeking customized behavioral reforms for difficult daughters, wives, or sisters. Clients could request the removal of artistic tendencies, the suppression of intellectual curiosity, the erasure of romantic inclinations, or the creation of docile, obedient homemakers. For each desired outcome, the sisters had designed specialized procedures, refined through years of experimentation. And for such precision work, they charged exorbitant fees. But the veneer of control that had protected them for nearly 2 decades began to splinter in the winter of 1818. That year, a young woman named Sarah Wittmann arrived at the convent under circumstances that would ultimately lead to the Ashford sisters' downfall. Sarah was not like the others. She did not arrive broken or cowed. She came with defiance in her eyes, with an intellect and inner fire that had not been extinguished by social shame. Her offense? Bearing a child out of wedlock and refusing despite months of coercion by her wealthy Boston family to name the father. Sarah came not to be corrected, but to resist. Her parents, prominent Boston merchants with reputations to uphold, had first tried to resolve the scandal quietly. A discreet marriage, perhaps, or a private adoption, arranged through trusted contacts. Anything to preserve the illusion of familial dignity. But Sarah refused. She demanded the right to keep her child and live her life on her own terms. No shame, no silence, no surrender. In response, her family did what so many powerful families had done before. They declared her mentally unfit and had her committed to the Convent of Eternal Tears. She was 24, fiercely intelligent. And unlike most women sent to the convent, she had been educated. Before her pregnancy, Sarah's parents, still basking in the glow of their progressive ideals, had encouraged her learning. Through her father's business ties to Boston physicians, she'd gained unusual access to medical literature, including texts on anatomy and early psychiatric theory. It was that very knowledge that would become her shield. From the moment she stepped into the convent, Sarah saw through the facade. The other women didn't walk, they drifted, with a robotic detachment, their movements precise but lifeless. Their faces wore soft, blank expressions. Their voices, when they spoke, were measured and monotone as though rehearsed. Many had scarring along their scalps, partially concealed beneath carefully arranged hair, and more disturbingly, they bore unmistakable signs of neurological trauma. Slurred speech, disjointed memory, altered personalities that bore no resemblance to the women they once were. Sarah recognized the symptoms instantly. This was not divine healing. This was surgical mutilation of the brain. During her first week at the convent, Sarah was subjected to the standard battery of preliminary examinations, a ritual masked as medical inquiry, but designed for something far more sinister. Her skull was measured with calipers and compasses. She was interrogated at length about her habits, fears, beliefs, and tendencies. The physical tests she endured had little to do with spiritual well-being. They were neurological in nature, designed to map reflexes, memory retention, and emotional response. The Ashford sisters were initially perplexed. Most women who arrived at the convent, shamed, discarded, and defeated, quickly submitted to its rigid authority. But Sarah remained defiant, even as the sisters escalated their methods. She was locked in solitary confinement for days, denied basic nourishment and hydration, and subjected to hours of psychological assault. Every insult, every deprivation, was meticulously calculated to strip her identity and prepare her for what the sisters euphemistically called intensive reformation. Sister Temperance, the mistress of behavioral deconstruction, took personal charge of Sarah's case. She applied every technique she had perfected over the years: sensory deprivation, temperature extremes, sleep disruption, and constant verbal degradation, each intended to shatter Sarah's resolve. But Sarah would not break. Instead, she endured. She observed. She memorized. In her moments of solitude, she mentally sketched the layout of the convent, tracked the timing of guard rotations, noted the habits of the sisters, and began to shape the outline of a plan. And then she began to write. With berry juice for ink and scraps of cloth and paper smuggled from laundry or refuse, Sarah started a hidden journal, concealed in the seams of her clothing. In it, she recorded her observations, suspicions, and experiences, a living document that would one day expose the truth. Her moment came in March 1819, during a violent thunderstorm that flooded the convent's lower levels and plunged the institution into disarray. In the chaos, Sarah saw her chance. The flooding forced the sisters to relocate both equipment and patients to the upper floors, plunging the convent into chaos. Hallways swarmed with novices carrying surgical instruments, medical records, and unconscious women on stretchers. Amid the confusion, Sarah slipped from her guards and vanished into the restricted lower levels. What she found in the basement chambers surpassed even her darkest suspicions. The rooms, half submerged in muddy water, held evidence of monstrous science. Restraint-equipped operating tables stood rusting in the dim light, flanked by trays of surgical tools grotesquely modified for procedures far removed from conventional medicine. The walls were lined with shelves of glass jars, each containing preserved human brain tissue meticulously labeled with patient names, dates, and handwritten procedural notes. Sarah's medical knowledge turned every step into a waking nightmare. She recognized the terminology and techniques: calculated excisions of brain matter, removal of tissue from areas responsible for emotion, memory, and cognition, all described in cold, clinical detail. The notes included sketches of exposed skulls, anatomical diagrams, and post-operative observations measuring the degree of behavioral change achieved by each intervention. But it was the correspondence files that confirmed the true scope of the atrocity. Tucked into metal drawers were letters, hundreds of them, from physicians across Europe. They discussed pricing structures for data sets, requests for specific behavioral outcomes, and instructions for acquiring anatomical specimens, all with the detached language of a commercial exchange. What Sarah held in her trembling hands was proof that the Convent of Eternal Tears was not just a place of twisted therapy. It was an international marketplace for human experimentation, profiting from the suffering and mutilation of vulnerable women. She stuffed what evidence she could carry into the lining of her dress. Copies of surgical notes, letters of transaction, anatomical sketches, anything that could be used to expose the truth. Her heart pounded, not just with terror, but with a new urgency. She could not wait. She had to escape. Now. Sarah knew the intensive treatment was scheduled within days, a fate that would likely leave her as broken and hollowed as the other women she had seen. Her window was closing fast. The sister's suspicion of her defiance was growing, and with it, the danger. Then, on a moonless night in early April 1819, Sarah seized her chance. She overpowered a guard and slipped into the surrounding forest, fleeing into the cold darkness. The Ashford sisters wasted no time. They launched a massive, well-coordinated search, desperate to recapture Sarah before she could reveal the horrific truth behind their sanctuary. For 3 grueling days, Sarah dodged their grasp, navigating the wilderness on nothing but spring water and the handful of edible plants she could identify. Her every step was shadowed by the sisters' relentless pursuit, a hunt fueled by fear and fury, masked under the guise of protecting a fragile mind. She could hear the men's voices cutting through the forest stillness, calling out, sweeping through the trees as they methodically searched every thicket and hollow. On the second night, caught in a sudden downpour, Sarah stumbled right into a search party. Only quick thinking and a lifetime of knowledge from childhood visits to a grandfather's logging camp saved her. She slipped away unnoticed and spent the night hidden inside a hollowed fallen tree, heart pounding as she listened to the searchers comb the forest nearby. Just when you think the horrors of the Maine wilderness couldn't get any darker, Sarah's desperate flight only grows more intense. If this story sends chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who craves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our channel, and subscribe to never miss another tale from the shadows. Let's discover together what happens when Sarah finally reaches civilization, and the shocking truth begins to unravel. By the 3rd day, Sarah's body was failing her. Dehydrated, exhausted, and battered by the cold April wind, her feet bled from trekking barefoot across the unforgiving terrain. Signs of hypothermia crept in, but still, her fierce determination to expose the Ashford sisters drove her onward beyond the pain, beyond reason. Her salvation came in the form of a trapper named Joshua Meadows, checking his lines in the early morning mist. At first, Joshua eyed the wild woman warily. But when Sarah revealed intimate details of the convent, details only an insider could know, his skepticism gave way to concern. Her injuries were undeniable, her desperation unmistakable. And her story, though unbelievable, held a consistency that defied dismissal as mere madness. Joshua offered food, warmth, and, most critically, safe passage to the sheriff's office in Millbridge. Yet even in his company, Sarah's fear never lessened. She knew the Ashford sisters' reach extended far beyond the remote wilderness, that their shadowy influence threatened to swallow her whole if she faltered. When Sarah Wittmann finally arrived at Sheriff William Hawthorne's office on April 18, 1819, her disheveled appearance and wild accusations met with the same disbelief that had greeted Thomas Brewster 16 years before. Sheriff Hawthorne, a man who valued reason and calm judgment, assumed her to be another victim of wilderness-induced delirium, a lost soul broken by isolation and fear. Sarah's tale of systematic human experimentation was too horrific, too fantastic, to be accepted as truth. However, several factors set Sarah's testimony apart from the usual stories of troubled minds. First, her intimate knowledge of the convent's interior layout matched details never made public. She described not just the general structure, but specific features: the basement chambers, the arrangement of surgical equipment, and hidden storage areas. Information only someone with extensive insider access could possess. More importantly, Sarah had smuggled out crucial documents during her escape: surgical logs, correspondence with European medical institutions, and patient records that provided undeniable proof of the Ashford sisters' atrocities. Though written in cold clinical language, these documents revealed procedures that would now be recognized as war crimes. Evidence of a horrifying, systematic campaign of human experimentation hidden behind the convent's walls. The first document was a surgical log detailing procedures on 23 women over 8 months. Each entry was meticulously recorded: preoperative personality profiles, detailed surgical notes describing how holes were drilled into skulls, and implements inserted to damage or remove precise areas of brain tissue, followed by postoperative reports tracking profound changes in behavior, memory, and cognition. One particularly chilling case detailed the story of Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old committed for the crime of excessive reading and intellectual curiosity, traits deemed dangerously inappropriate for a woman of her time. The surgical notes detailed a procedure specifically designed to damage the brain regions responsible for learning and memory, with the stated goal of curbing the patient's compulsive fascination with books and abstract thought, while preserving only the most basic domestic skills. The post-operative observations revealed the horrific success of this intervention. Margaret's personality had been irreversibly altered. Her love of reading was completely extinguished. Her vocabulary shrank drastically, and her capacity for complex reasoning was profoundly impaired. The notes ended with clinical satisfaction. Patient now exhibits appropriate feminine docility and shows no interest in activities beyond basic household tasks. The second document was even more damning: a detailed correspondence file containing letters from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating the purchase of cranial intervention research data for the staggering sum of 4,000 Austrian florins. These letters specifically requested detailed documentation on surgical techniques designed to eliminate unwanted memories and personality traits by modifying brain structures. Dr. Zimmermann's correspondence revealed the existence of a vast international network of researchers purchasing human experimentation data from the Ashford sisters. Universities in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris were all recipients of regular reports describing the results of procedures that would be outlawed under any civilized legal system. In essence, the sisters operated as commercial suppliers of illicit scientific knowledge, information that legitimate researchers could not acquire through ethical means. The third document was perhaps the most horrifying of all: a patient catalog listing over 600 women processed through the convent's programs since 1798. The catalog was meticulously organized by treatment type, with detailed annotations describing each patient's specific procedures and their ultimate fate. Most entries were marked "reformed and returned women" who had undergone surgical modification and were sent back to their families with irrevocably altered personalities. A smaller number were listed as permanent residents, women said to have chosen a life of seclusion within the convent, though their exact whereabouts remained unknown. Most chilling of all were nearly 200 entries marked simply as expired women who had died during or shortly after the experimental procedures. Sheriff Hawthorne, confronted with this overwhelming and horrific evidence, understood immediately that he faced crimes beyond anything he had encountered before. He swiftly organized a raid on the convent, assembling a force of 15 armed men, fully aware this would be far more than a routine arrest. Urgent messages were sent to authorities in Portland and Boston, calling for federal marshals with jurisdiction over crimes of such magnitude. But the Ashford sisters had been watching. Their extensive network of informants in Millbridge alerted them to the impending raid. By the time the raiding party arrived at the convent on the morning of May 20th, 1819, the building stood eerily silent and completely abandoned. The sisters had vanished under cover of darkness, taking with them most of their portable equipment and crucial documents, leaving behind only what they could not carry. The search of the deserted convent uncovered a chamber of horrors that traumatized even the most hardened members of the raiding party. The basement revealed a fully equipped surgical theater, outfitted with instruments specifically designed for delicate cranial procedures. Shelves lining the walls held hundreds of preserved brain specimens, each meticulously labeled with information about the patient and the experiments performed. Behind a false wall, a hidden chamber concealed 47 bodies in various states of preservation, all bearing clear signs of cranial surgery. These corpses were immersed in a chemical solution, alcohol and other preservatives, kept for ongoing study. Each was tagged with detailed records of the procedures conducted and the outcomes observed before death. Investigators also uncovered an immense trove of documentation abandoned in the sisters' hasty flight. File cabinets contained thousands of pages of surgical notes, patient records, and correspondence with medical institutions around the globe. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Over 2 decades of systematic human experimentation, detailing procedures that would remain unrecognized and abhorrent to mainstream medicine for years to come. When confronted with the evidence of his complicity, Dr. Samuel Hartwell initially sought to justify his role. Desperately, he claimed he was advancing medical science for the good of humanity. These women were already lost to society, he argued. Their conditions made them unsuitable for normal life. At least their suffering contributed to knowledge that will help future generations. However, when confronted with the full scope of the experimentation and undeniable evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical treatment, Dr. Hartwell suffered what appeared to be a complete mental collapse. In a final guarded confession from his cell in the Millbridge jail, he revealed the shocking true identities of the Ashford sisters and the full extent of their criminal past. The women known as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novice Temperance Ashford were, in fact, Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford, trained physicians expelled from European medical institutions for conducting unauthorized and unethical human experiments. Dr. Brennan had been banned from practicing medicine in Scotland after multiple patients died during her experimental surgical procedures aimed at correcting feminine hysteria. Dr. Prudence Ashford was dismissed from the University of Edinburgh Medical School after being caught performing illegal experiments on asylum patients, attempting to map brain function by systematically damaging different cranial regions. Dr. Temperance Ashford, the youngest, had been her sister's protégé, developing psychological conditioning techniques designed to amplify the effects of their surgical interventions. The 3 women had fled Europe in 1797, adopting false identities as Anglican nuns to conceal their activities and continue their research in a remote location free from medical oversight and legal constraints. For more than 20 years, they perfected methods to modify human behavior through surgical and psychological means, accumulating knowledge that legitimate researchers of the era could only dream of. The manhunt for the escaped Ashford sisters quickly became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in early American history, involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and even international cooperation with European authorities. However, the 3 women had vanished completely, leaving behind only the horrific evidence of 2 decades of systematic human experimentation. The investigation uncovered that the sisters had maintained multiple escape routes from the convent and amassed substantial wealth from their illicit activities. Bank records revealed transfers of enormous sums to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries over the years. The total amount exceeded $50,000, a fortune equivalent to millions in today's currency. They had also established false identities and safe houses across North America and Europe, indicating their plans for eventual escape had been in motion since the beginning of their American operations. Shipping records showed they had been gradually moving equipment and documentation out of the convent for months prior to Sarah's escape, anticipating the possibility of discovery. The full extent of their criminal enterprise came into focus. Over 21 years, the Ashford sisters had processed more than 600 women through their experimental programs. Approximately 250 were returned to their families as successfully treated patients, though all exhibited signs of brain damage consistent with surgical intervention. Another 50 were reported to have chosen permanent residence at the convent, but no trace of these women was ever found. The investigation concluded that the sisters had likely murdered these patients when their conditions made them unsuitable for return, preserving the bodies for ongoing study and disposing of the remains when preservation was no longer useful. The remaining 200 women were discovered in various states of preservation within the convent's hidden chambers. These were patients who had either died during experimental procedures or had been deliberately killed when their responses provided valuable research data. The systematic preservation of these bodies indicated they had been maintained for comparative study over extended periods. The investigation also uncovered an extensive network of collaborators within the medical and academic communities. Dr. Hartwell was only one of several physicians who referred patients to the convent and supplied medical materials in exchange for access to experimental results. Postal workers, suppliers, and even some local officials had been bribed to maintain secrecy about the convent's operations. Universities across America and Europe had unknowingly integrated the Ashford sisters' research into their medical curricula. Surgical techniques and psychological theories taught to new generations of physicians were based on human experimentation conducted in the Maine wilderness. This revelation forced a painful re-evaluation of the origins of medical knowledge and the profession's ethical standards. Families of the victims faced an agonizing dilemma: seek justice and risk social ruin, or remain silent to protect their reputations. Public acknowledgement that their daughters and wives had endured horrific experiments would have exposed them to scandal and destroyed their standing. Most chose silence, bearing their grief in private. This widespread conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of the Ashford sisters' crimes was never officially acknowledged. After 6 months, the investigation was quietly closed, with the majority of evidence sealed away in government archives unopened for over a century. The official record tersely stated that 3 women operating a fraudulent medical facility had fled justice, leaving behind evidence of irregular treatment methods. Eventually, local residents burned the convent to the ground, attempting to erase all traces of the atrocities that had occurred there. However, the extensive documentation of the sisters' experiments was preserved and eventually disseminated to medical institutions worldwide. Ironically, research obtained through such horrific means contributed to legitimate advances in understanding brain function and psychological disorders. Sarah Wittmann, the sole survivor to escape and expose the truth, struggled for years with the trauma of her experience. She spent months providing testimony to investigators and helping to identify other victims, but the emotional toll was devastating. The knowledge that she was the only person willing to speak publicly about the horrors she had witnessed isolated her from a society eager to forget such uncomfortable truths. Eventually, Sarah relocated to California under an assumed name, working as a teacher while trying to rebuild her life. She never married and maintained minimal contact with her family, who were embarrassed by her public testimony about the convent. Her detailed memoir, written shortly before her death in 1863, remains the most complete account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears and serves as crucial historical evidence of the sisters' crimes. The Ashford sisters themselves were never captured, though unconfirmed reports placed them in various locations throughout the Americas and Europe in the following decades. Some investigators believed they continued their work under different identities, while others suspected they had been killed by associates seeking to eliminate witnesses. One reported sighting in Argentina in 1847 described 3 elderly women operating a private medical facility for wealthy families, but the investigation proved inconclusive. The most credible account came from a French physician who claimed to have encountered Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris in 1856. According to his report, she was working under an assumed name as a private physician specializing in nervous disorders in women, employing techniques suspiciously similar to those documented at the convent. However, when authorities investigated, the woman had already vanished, leaving behind only tantalizing hints of her true identity. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears stands as one of the most systematic and prolonged examples of human experimentation in American history. The Ashford sisters combined rigorous scientific methodology with utter moral bankruptcy, creating a research program that advanced medical knowledge at an unfathomable human cost, destroying hundreds of lives. Their meticulous documentation revealed techniques and insights that mainstream medicine would not officially recognize for decades. This case also exposed the vulnerability of women in early American society, where social pressures and legal constraints enabled 3 criminals to operate with impunity for over 20 years. the systematic exploitation of society's most vulnerable members, justified by claims of medical progress and social benefit, reveals how noble intentions can mask horrific crimes. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the conspiracy of silence that followed the sisters' exposure. A chilling demonstration of society's willingness to suppress uncomfortable truths rather than confront the reality of systematic abuse. Families, medical institutions, and government officials who chose secrecy over justice ensured the victims' suffering would be forgotten, allowing similar atrocities to potentially recur. This mystery reveals the terrifying potential of unchecked scientific ambition combined with social prejudice against vulnerable populations. That 3 women could run a systematic program of human experimentation for over 2 decades, with tacit support from medical professionals and community leaders, shows how dangerous knowledge becomes when pursued without moral constraints or ethical oversight. What do you think of this story? Could such systematic horrors really have remained hidden for so long in early American society? The evidence suggests that the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from human compassion and ethical responsibility, can lead to atrocities that challenge our very understanding of civilized behavior. Do you believe similar crimes could still occur today, hidden behind facades of respectability and scientific progress? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss this chilling chapter of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and crave more dark mysteries, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves uncovering the buried secrets of our past. The shadows of history hold many truths powerful people have tried to erase forever. See you in the next video, where we'll reveal another dark secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about America.